Welcome to Bharat Shakti. I'm Ramananda Sengupta. And today we're going to discuss the increasingly aggressive posturing by the Chinese Coast Guard in the South China Sea. Our special guest today is Vijay D Chafekar, former additional director of the Indian Coast Guard. Not only has he commanded various classes of ships during his 37 years of service, he's also a trained pilot who operated Coast Guard dorniers on both the coasts. And he's also widely traveled. He's represented the Indian Coast Guard at national and international maritime forums on transnational crimes, disaster response, search and rescue, and law enforcement. Thank you so very much for joining us today, sir, at such short notice. It's a pleasure having you with us.
Thank you for this opportunity once again with Bharat Shakti. Thank you.
Pleasure, sir. So let's take it from the top. The recent sort of very intimidating tactics by the Chinese Coast Guard in the against the Philippines Navy recently, and then again earlier against Vietnamese vessels as well as a few other vessels from the region, point to a sort of a escalatory kind of a posturing. How do you read this, sir?
Well, this recent incident in South China Sea happened close to Second Thomas Shoal, which is part of Spratly Group of Islands, and this feature is claimed by Philippines as it is about 100 miles plus from its shore, so well within its claim for EEZ and continental shelf.
Okay.
Now, to reinforce its claim on this shoal, Philippines Navy, way back in 1999, grounded their old LST at this site and later converted that grounded vessel into an outpost.
Oh.
And since then, they have been maintaining and supplying provisions to this outpost, even rotating of the crew which is deployed at this garrison. Well, China objected to this vessel being grounded and used as an outpost, and in 2014 they tried to obstruct the supplies being given to this or supplies and this outpost being maintained. Now we know how they have been approaching. Chinese have been approaching, asserting their claim in South China Sea, which is like something like claiming whole of the South China Sea as a historical waters.
It went from 9-9 to 10-9.
Yeah. So that was earlier 11-9, just because they had the issue resolved with northern borders of Vietnam, they converted it into 9-9, and then since they claim it to historic and inconsistent with what law of sea convention says. Anyway, but how they're still asserting their claims? Initially, they used fishing vessels manned by Chinese uniformed personnel, what we call as maritime militia. Now, advantage in that was it was never an official law enforcement action. If something happened, it was between two fishing vessels that has happened, but they achieved the purpose of enforcing their jurisdiction or obstructing the activities they did not want to take place in the their claimed waters of jurisdiction. Here, since 2014, China has been actually deploying their Coast Guard ships, and one thing probably caused behind that is in last 10 years there has been huge growth in capabilities, particularly the surface assets which Chinese Coast Guard has. There's something like 3 to 4-fold increase in those surface assets. If you look at only the vessels of 1,000 tons and above, those numbers have gone up from about 40 to 130. That is huge increase in the larger platforms in such a short span of time. So what we see here is that now the posture is a little aggressive. In 2021, we heard the Chinese use the water cannons to deter or disrupt the supplies which were being maintained for this outpost, Philippine outpost. And in the recent incident, they took a very aggressive posture, conducting dangerous maneuvers in the vicinity of Philippines vessel. And in fact, what we saw or what is reported is that they actually rammed into Philippine vessels, endangering safety of the vessel as well as the safety of the crew on board that. Now, what we're to see from this incident is that most of the islands, or for that matter, the shoals, atolls, low tide elevation, rocks, everything in the South China Sea is either controlled or physically occupied by one of the stakeholders in South China Sea, mostly by China in the parishes, but rest by all the stakeholders. They are occupying every feature in the South China Sea. Now, in this case, if there is an indication that the status quo is being changed by use of force, which is a new thing which is happening, which is so far it was only advisory or destruction, temporary destruction, and again there is lull. This and there is physical force being used to change the status quo. It has huge implications for the rest of the South China Sea positions by various stakeholders. So I think it is very significant what has happened recently.
Hmm. But sir, how much of this has to do with the new sort of, Coast Guard law that they sort of, adopted in February this year, which is ambiguous as best, but also I believe it is illegal in many ways.
Now, what is the empowerment by China under empowerment this Coast Guard recently in 2021 under this legislation? What is significant in that is, I would call it the claim itself is illegal, and that illegal claim is now being enforced by illegal empowerment of the Chinese Coast Guard. Why the claim is illegal? Because China is signatory to the Law of Sea Convention, and Law of Sea Convention does not recognize such kind of historic waters claim. That is why Philippines had gone to arbitration tribunal, because we must take a note that all the stakeholders in South China Sea are signatory to Law of Sea Convention, including China, People's
Right.
Republic of China. So ROC is not, because it's not being recognized as a separate state. So, but PRC is, and all other states are signatory to Law of Sea Convention, and all of them are entitled for the maritime zones the way all other states are. India has claimed maritime zones based on Law of Sea Convention. So also our neighbors have claimed, and we have resolved our maritime border dispute. But those disputes are not resolved in South China Sea. People say that disputes are not only between the other states and China, but between them also, Vietnam, Philippines, or Philippines, Malaysia, or Brunei. But those disputes can be resolved, provided this huge claim on whole of South China Sea under that 9-dash line, if that is applied, then nothing can happen to resolve or delimit the maritime borders within South China Sea. So that's the
Right.
main issue. Now, once you have this kind of claim, and to enforce that claim, you now empower your Coast Guard. First, as I said, there's huge capability acquisition in last 10 years. Then these Coast Guard ships are heavily armed with heavy machine guns, and 76 anti-aircraft guns are fitted. So that is kind of power which can be projected through these Coast Guard ships. And I feel one more significant thing is now the Chinese Coast Guard is empowered to use force to enforce this jurisdiction. Chinese law, like any of those countries which are signatory to Law of Sea Convention, has maritime zones claim under their law. But it says those claim on the maritime zones, that is territorial water, EEZ, and continental shelf, is without prejudice, or in addition to their historic claims on jurisdiction within the 9-dash line. And the Coast Guard empowerment now is not for the enforcement of maritime zones under UNCLOS or Law of Sea Convention, but to enforce jurisdiction within 9-dash line. And with such a heavy capability building and heavily armed vessels. So definitely, we know what's coming here after.
Right. Sir, you've commanded a lot of Indian Coast Guard ships, and you've sort of studied the Chinese, Coast Guard as well. How would you sort of, differentiate in the two sort of Coast Guards in terms of not just role and mandate, but perhaps even the size of the shipping?
I would like to first talk about just size of ship. It is surprising the way large size Chinese Coast Guard ships are being acquired. Because Indian Coast Guard has gone through huge capability building plan in last 10, 15 years. We have substantially increased our surface assets and air assets, medium size and large size of ships. But the largest size of ships which Coast Guard has, which is about 2,500 tons to 3,000 tons. And the 3,000 tons vessels are special role vessels, like pollution control vessels. So they require to be large. Otherwise, we haven't found a requirement for a vessel larger than that. But look at the size of Chinese largest vessel. It's monstrous. It is 12,000 ton vessel. Is the largest Chinese Coast Guard vessel. Now, how big is 12,000 ton vessel? Our Vishakapatnam class Indian Navy frigates, destroyers, Vishakapatnam class destroyers, they are 6,000 to 7,000 ton vessels. This is Chinese,
Hmm.
so that is huge. But I think I am thankful to you for asking this question to compare the of Chinese Coast Guard and Indian Coast Guard. I would say Indian Coast Guard was constituted to protect India's national interests in the maritime zones in 77, and since then, it also has done huge work to protect our national interests in terms of providing security, in terms of anti-piracy, anti-smuggling, anti-drug trafficking, and these are on security aspect, but at the same time, huge work on humanitarian missions, safety of life and property access, huge work done, not within our EZ, but much beyond in the coordination with our neighboring countries. Indian Coast Guard has an excellent exchange programs and coordination with our neighboring maritime states. We carry out our operation in coordination with them. We cooperate. There is great amount of goodwill with the neighboring states. I must say, the India and its maritime state, neighboring maritime states, they're able to work together, at least on this part of law enforcement and safety of life and property and humanitarian missions. So I think this is a very different perspective of Indian Coast Guard as compared to how Chinese Coast Guard is introduced or it is capable, what is expected to do and likely to do in near future in South China Sea, particularly South China Sea.
Hmm. So, talking about the legal aspects of the whole thing, we've also had, disputes over maritime limits and other things with our maritime neighbors. We have a huge coastline. Compared to the Chinese sort of, technique of just saying everything is mine, how have we handled it?
Well, we see one of the main problem in South China Sea is the maritime borders are not delimited. Delimitation is not done. Borders are not settled because there are overlapping claims. But there is nothing new. India shares this maritime border with 7 maritime neighbors. Normally, people think about Bangladesh, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka as our maritime neighbors. But we have our maritime boundary with Myanmar, with Thailand, with Indonesia. With Indonesia, clearly overlapping claim. But way back in late 70s, we resolved this maritime border issues by having bilateral agreements and even trilateral agreement between India, Indonesia, and Thailand, because there is a tri-junction point there. Similarly, there is a bilateral agreement between India and Sri Lanka, India and Maldives, and there is also a trilateral agreement for a trilateral junction point where there are overlapping claims of 3 countries. I would like to highlight here, like, say, the southernmost island of our Lakshadweep, Minicoy, is just about 50-60 miles from northernmost island of Maldives. But we have relied, yes, we have relied on equidistant basis, which is provided by the international law, and resolved the maritime border issue. Only place we could not resolve through negotiation was with Bangladesh. So we again adopted what is provided under international law for dispute resolution. Either option was to go to International Court of Justice or Permanent Arbitration Tribunal. The dispute was taken to Permanent Arbitration Tribunal and award was given. Now, India and Bangladesh maritime borders stand resolved as per the award of the tribunal. I would like to particularly mention here what we had claimed in our dispute with Bangladesh on maritime border. Obviously, we got less than that what we expected to be a reasonable settlement. But we did not challenge that. We showed the magnanimity or mutual accommodation so that the issue can be resolved. That is how we don't have, except for Pakistan, we have no outstanding issues of maritime borders with any of our neighbors.
Oh, okay. So we have none at all. What about Sri Lanka and places like that?
There's no dispute. We have bilateral agreements, including for the historic waters. Like when we say in South China Sea, China cannot sustain its claim under Law of Sea Convention for 9-dash line. So it says that as the convention says, where the matters are not governed by the convention, they can be taken by the general international law or public international law. Okay. So where you can take the right for that is customary international laws, that claiming that the usage is customary historically. But for such a claim to sustain, there has to be continuous unbroken usage, and most importantly, there has to be legal sentiment to accept that claim by other states based on the historical usage, and there is none of those things exist there. In Indian case, India did claim historic waters and historic bay during the preparatory work of Law of Sea Convention. Our historic bay is in the Park Bay, adjoining India and Sri Lanka and historic waters adjoining India and Sri Lanka south of Bag Bay. Now we converted that water into internal waters, but the two disputing party or two claimants, India and Sri Lanka, we have signed an agreement and made a mutually agreed border. What about the third party claim? No third party claim is affected because nobody has interest to enter Parkway for freedom of navigation or any other
Right.
purpose. So that is not affected.
Mm-hmm.
As far as Southside historic waters claim is concerned, again we have with Sri Lanka mutually agreed border. We have extended our territorial waters claim under this historic waters arrangement, but that also doesn't affect the third party right for freedom of navigation. They can freely exercise that. And I feel because of this, that there is no dispute and it is not contested, so such a claim is recognized. The way China has made, Chinese claim is in exclusion of everybody else's claim. Nobody can claim any maritime zones the way China is claiming 9 dash line, and such a claim will always be contested. And if it's contested, it cannot be claimed as a historical right.
Right, of course, of course. So, coming back to the Philippines, I think the Indian Coast Guard has recently linked an MOU of cooperation with the Philippines Coast Guard. So I think just very recently, I think August or something it was
In
said.
August 23, yes.
Okay, so how do you see that cooperation evolving, and do you think we have anything to suggest to them in ways of sort of taking on the Chinese?
Well, Indian Coast Guard has a MOU for sharing of the experiences or training exchanges with several Coast Guard within the South China Sea with Vietnam Coast Guard as well as with Philippines Coast Guard and beyond with Korean Coast Guard as well as Japanese Coast Guard. But these MOUs are at operational level much more symbolic, and I think the substantive work happens at the exchange of training facilities and experiences. But yes, within our immediate neighborhood, yes, Coast Guard has substantially helped our maritime neighbors with respect with the assets and also the capacity sharing for their ease at surveillance requirements.
So, if you look at India's role in the South China Sea, I think from what I understand, India has studiously refused to get sort of, actively involved in the freedom of navigation and all that kind of stuff in terms of the Indian Navy. But do you think India can play a role in sort of capacity building of all of the countries in that region, particularly when it comes to the Coast Guard?
I think yes, because we've been doing, and as I said, we not only provided ships to Sri Lanka, Maldives, and Mauritius, but also Coast Guard boats have been provided to Seychelles and Tanzania. So we've gone that far in Indian Ocean to helping our partners and neighbors. So it is very much possible that Make in India projects are working so well. So there are indigenous, whether it is ships, armaments, or any other things which can be shared to our friendly nations. It would happen more proactively, I believe, in as India interest in Indo-Pacific is growing. I think one of the things which I did not mention was, yes, what you said was the South China Sea. The interests are not only of the stakeholders who are bordering South China Sea, but also extraterritorial. It is interest for us to have our freedom of navigation rights ensured, and so also the every state outside South China Sea, they would like their freedom of navigation rights to be protected.
So what does that mean? I mean, if you're not willing to sort of get onto the freedom of navigation movement with them, but at the same time we believe that that we must have access to that region, isn't that a slightly contradictory kind of a position?
No, I didn't say will not directly, we will not help, but there is a way and method how we can contribute to that. The immediate mechanism available for Philippines and other nations is ASEAN. Now, ASEAN as a bloc can work to ensure that the matters do not escalate and follow the rule of law. Because what is provided under the international law, that is the only way. There is no other way it can be resolved. ASEAN way, as they say, there's little consensus, no use of force, and allow the things to cool down. So they are not actively involving into the dispute. But that is one of the reasons that although they achieved the code of conduct to prevent further escalation, but they could not provide
Hmm.
for dispute resolution under the code of conduct mechanism which ASEAN
Right.
created. But then there are other stakeholders. US has got a direct pact with Philippines for mutual defense. India doesn't have that kind of arrangement, but India has
Of
an
course.
interest, and it would depend how our foreign policy now evolves for a more active role in South China Sea.
Hmm. So coming back to the Coast Guard law that China has framed, which is there. I mean, clearly it is sort of violates very various sort of principles of maritime rule. Why is there not a big noise being made about it by the regional players there?
See, as you said rightly, it should have been ASEAN who should make the biggest noise because ASEAN was created for economic and security cooperation. If your security is affected, your economic progress is going to be affected. Now, but problem is that out of 10 members of ASEAN, only 4 or 5 are directly party to the South China Sea dispute. And that is how China also uses that those who are not
Okay.
party to it, they do not like to directly involve into the dispute as an en bloc because they are not directly gaining or losing. But
Hmm.
that's the one issue why ASEAN as a combined force is not able to influence the uh, what's happening in South China Sea on the security matters. And definitely, I'm sure they must be realizing if the security situation deteriorates there, it's going to affect the economic progress of all the ASEAN states. But that's the
Hmm.
reason why the parties to the dispute and those who are member of ASEAN but not direct party to dispute that differentiation is happening.
Hmm. So, I'm a bit of a layman when it comes to, very sort of deep naval matters. But I've always been curious that given the amount of sort of ships that sort of are in that South China Sea region at any given point, what are the chances of some kind of a mishap happening and escalating into something big?
I do not think that that kind of risk is emerging right away. We can see how China is playing this. They have just graduated from using maritime militia to direct involving Coast Guard to enforce. Now, see, it is like on the map, you create your claim. Now, map does not create title, but you just create a claim and then start negotiating on from that fantastic claim. Like we have a
Right,
situation in India where you have Arunachal Pradesh shown as South Tibet and then negotiate.
right.
What is that? So you have a fantastic claim and then start negotiating. So China knows that you make that there is completely unlawful claim, not recognized under any law, neither treaty law nor customary law. Still, you make that claim and use force to assert that claim and then negotiate. So whatever they get, they are beneficial in that, and whatever when the states agree to negotiate from this point, whatever outcome they are going to be losers. So China will not be interested in escalating the way you express the concern. I don't think they would do that. They would like to drag the matter as much as possible and gain as much as possible from that fantastic untenable crane, but still they're gaining on that.
Let's come back to India in
Yes.
that aspect. How do you see the role of our Coast Guard in the sort of the ongoing process, of integration within the Ministry of Defense?
Well, I think one of the best thing that happened that government of India proactively enacted Maritime Zones of India Act. That is when the preparatory work of Law of Sea Convention was going on. Even before convention was passed, the Maritime Zones of India Act was enacted. And the moment Act was enacted, they realized we are such a huge maritime jurisdiction, economic jurisdiction. To enforce that jurisdiction very proactively, Coast Guard was created. I think these were two great events, but even the bigger one, what the decision government of India took was to place Coast Guard under Ministry of Defense. And that has worked really well. The way Coast Guard has grown, the phenomenal achievements of the Coast Guard, I think the large part of that credit goes to organization being placed under Ministry of Defense. And as far as the being part of Ministry of Defense, Coast Guard works very closely with Indian Navy and also with the other stakeholders, state and central stakeholders, and can act as a go between the other stakeholders and Indian Navy for the maritime security and other security requirements of our EEZ and maritime borders. I think this has worked really well, and I wish this arrangement continues. There is a
Mhm.
maritime security advisor or coordinator who is appointed, and if he finds there are any gaps to improve the synergy between all the stakeholders in maritime security, there is an independent body under NSA available as a maritime security advisor coordinator.
Mhm. So the last question, again, because of my own curiosity, um, you know, since let's say, I mean, you mentioned that we have been upgrading our Coast Guard as well in a big way. Um, I mean, why I'm asking is that, during the 1971 war, I remember that we had sent our missile boats, we had to tow them halfway to Pakistan and then, use it and then tow them halfway back. Uh, right now, I'm sure things have changed a lot, but do you see any sort of gaps in what perhaps something that we should be doing, but we haven't, or something like that right now in terms of acquisition as well as other sort of, aspects of the Coast Guard?
Uh, I think
Do we need
post
more planes? Do we need more ships? I mean, is there something that?
I find the acquisition of surface assets and capabilities for surveillance, coastal surveillance, they have been substantially augmented. And then there is a mechanism for interagency coordination, information sharing. But what I find is that if we really want to ensure maritime security, we are testing our preparedness through series of exercises in our territorial waters. Now, threat does not originate in the territorial waters. It traverses all the way through high seas and EEZ. So I feel that if we have built up the capabilities and we have our SOPs in place, we must test our preparedness to deal with enemy and meet our enemy as far away as possible and not wait to deal it in territorial waters. And so our exercises should be designed so that we test our preparedness to meet that enemy in the high seas or EEZ. Because once it reaches territorial waters, the window available is so small for interception and dealing with it. So that's one change, probably. Yes, if we have already done huge capability augmentation for our interception surveillance and radar surveillance, electronic surveillance, why not test our preparedness to make sure that we are well prepared to deal with any threat transiting through high seas and EZ as well?
Mhm. And do you see any issues vis-a-vis networking with the other Indian forces in the system on the grid?
No, that has really worked very well. That is, I think, well-established system in this place. There are joint operation centers. There are
Mhm.
joint exercises. There are joint SOPs. So that part is really taken care of very well. So I think
Oh,
there is a good coordination, and I'm sure this smooth working with greater capabilities will ensure that another 2611 doesn't happen.
thank you very much, sir, for joining us today, and I look forward to having you with us again.
Thank you for this opportunity. My pleasure. Love to be part of this program. Thank you very
Thank
much.
you, sir. That was former ADG of the Indian Coast Guard, Vijay D Chafekar, talking to us about China's antics in the South China Sea using its Coast Guard, and as well as the pros and cons of the things, the way that we handle our Coast Guard. I do hope you enjoyed this conversation, and I look forward to seeing you again the next time. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe using the buttons below. Till we meet again, this is Ramananda Sengupta saying goodbye.